the story I'm going to tell you today is one of those that make you stop and think, man, how does a human being manage to carry a burden like that? You know, we have the image of the guy, the hero of faith, the chosen one. But what no one talks about is the toll that must have taken on his soul. We're talking about Noah. This happened like in a time that to us is just a legend, but to him it was the purest, rawest, and most painful reality. A good amount of time had passed since the waters receded, and the ark, which was his salvation and his prison at the same time, touched the ground. Noah, already in his 600 and something years, was there, trying to be the patriarch of a world that was entirely new, but which, in his eyes, was nothing more than a still, fresh global cemetery. He was in the plain of Shinar, planting the first vineyards, a task that should have been full of hope, but which for him was just a way to keep his hands busy while his mind screamed. Life was silence, a silence that was not of peace, but of oppression, because every breeze brought back the memory of the scream he didn't hear, but which he knew had existed. The earth was a sea of cold mud that had swallowed all his kin, and he felt like the only vestige, the last ghost of an era he had watched die. The great irony is that while his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, saw the vastness of that new horizon as a blank canvas full of promises, Noah only saw the void. The gaped sons were young or had barely left adolescence at the time of the flood. For them, the water had been just a huge and confusing journey. They did not have the vivid, detailed memory of what had happened before, of the world that was gone, of the people, of the evil. That unspeakable horror belonged only to him, and this isolated him in a profound and corrosive way. He couldn't share the weight, the guilt, the feeling of being a stained instrument in the hands of something greater. So, what did he do? He drowned himself. The alcohol, which he himself cultivated, wasn't just any vice. It was a desperate and credible attempt to silence the voices of his memory. He drank so the noise of the past would be quieter, so that the sun shining on the new earth would not seem so mocking in the face of the immensity of death that lay beneath his feet. That day, the feeling of being the contaminated beginning of all future humanity was a slow poison running through his veins. The morning sun, which should have been a golden embrace of a new start, was for Noah a merciless light, highlighting every irregularity on the ground. He was there, next to the vine fence he himself had erected. The smell of wet earth and the stubborn growth of new leaves were constant reminders of the life that persisted, but he felt it all as a spit on the memory. Guilt was a worm gnawing at his peace. He hadn't killed anyone, but he had survived everyone. And that survival seemed like a cosmic mistake, a painful anomaly. He remembered Methuselah, his grandfather, the oldest of all, whom he never knew if the waters reached or if natural death took him before. For Noah, that doubt was the last nail in the coffin of his sanity. He closed his eyes and saw the muddy water, not as the salvation the story told, but as a viscous liquid that carried with it the dignity and hope of millions of lives. In that instant, he only wished the earth would open up and swallow him, so that the silence would be complete and not just an agonizing pause between two worlds. No one in his family talked about what had happened. It was a silent pact, an unwritten rule that hung over meals and chores. The ark no longer existed, its remains probably scattered over the mountains. But for Noah, the ark was him, the cracked vessel that held the forbidden knowledge. His children walked in a way that seemed too light to him, and this irritated him in a way that made him feel petty and unjust. They were free of the burden, and he was the only prisoner. While Shem and Japheth worked with the animals and Ham was somewhere more distant, Noah picked up the clay jar that was hidden under a thick cloth, The wine was strong, dense, and smelled of crushed grapes and oblivion. He knew he was doing it again, seeking the alcoholic haze to blur the unbearable sharpness of his mind. The liquid burned on the way down, and for a brief moment, the weeping of the lost souls retreated, replaced by a heavy, numbing stupor. It was his only escape, his dark ritual in a world that insisted on being illuminated. The wine that went down Noah's throat was not just fermented liquid, it was the potion of self-deception he took to survive the daylight. In a short time, the ethereal fog began to crawl through his senses, not in a euphoric way, but with a heavy, grey drowsiness. His head, which had pulsed with the cruel sharpness of memories, now seemed full of old, damp cotton, and the surrounding landscape began to distort at the edges of his vision. The earth, which in the light of sobriety was an inert cemetery under the influence of alcohol, gained an almost liquid texture, as if the mud were slowly breathing under the thin layer of vegetation that was forming. He noticed, with a start of panic muffled by the drink, a grotesque and unusual detail. In certain parts of the valley that opened before him, the earth was not flat. There were small, gentle undulations, discrete elevations that were neither mountains nor hills formed by time, but rather rounded and elongated shapes arranged with a disturbing symmetry. Noah, the last man to know, recognized those shapes by their dimensions, even though they were under meters and meters of sediment. It was as if the new earth had been built upon a mosaic of tombs. The bodies of his kin, thousands of them, were there, mummified by the mud and awaiting the slow erosion to reveal themselves. The patriarch felt a cold heat run down his spine, and the wine in his stomach threatened to come back up, but he swallowed the nausea, forcing himself to look away from that horizon, which was, in fact, a shroud. The attempt to escape through drunkenness soon proved futile, as it always did. The stupor was just a temporary truce in the civil war raging inside his mind. Alcohol, instead of erasing the images, began to distort them, giving them an hallucinatory and even more terrifying quality. He found himself sitting, elbows on his knees, with his vision half blurred and his heart beating with an irregular frequency that sounded more like a funeral drum. He heard a sound, which was not loud, but pierced the afternoon silence. A very faint, almost inaudible crying, coming from far away from the middle of the younger trees. Noah raised his head, his eyelids heavy, trying to discern if it was an injured animal or just the wind playing with the foliage. But that sound had a human resonance, a guttural texture of despair that he would recognize in any dimension or time. It was the lament of the mother who lost her child, the whisper of anguish of someone drowning without him being able to do anything. He knew the sound was not real, but the feeling of terror it produced was more concrete than the ground beneath his feet. That groan was the sonic manifestation of his guilt, an auditory projection of the massacre he witnessed in silence from inside the ark. He staggered to his feet, feeling the urgent need to distance himself from that sound. But he knew that no matter how far he went, the weeping of the perished masses was anchored in his soul, and he was the only one to hear it, the involuntary and tortured guardian of a symphony of death that would never end. Noah, feeling his heart accelerate, not from strength but from induced terror and guilt, needed something to ground him in reality, a fixed point that was not that soft earth of corpses. He staggered to a chalice he had brought from the ark, an object that to his children was just a drinking utensil, but which to him was a strange relic of the world before. It was made of a dark, almost black, incredibly light wood, with a simple but deep carving of a bird with open wings. Not a dove, but a robust raven of a species he knew no longer existed. Touching the wood, he felt a cold, almost metallic vibration travel up his fingers. Suddenly, the smooth surface of the chalice seemed to sweat, releasing a peculiar smell which was not of mold or old wine, but of brackish water, that dense mixture of sea, mud, and something organic decaying. It was as if the object were retaining the essence of the flood, a time capsule that released the odor of horror only for him. He squeezed the chalice so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and for a moment the distant crying in his mind seemed to have condensed into that object. It was a silent dialogue between him and the relic, the only inanimate being that seemed to understand the weight of his memory. The patriarch moved away from the vineyard, leaving the jar half empty, and walked aimlessly towards a higher point, where a newly sprouted oak offered a meager shadow. His loneliness was not just the absence of company, it was the agonizing awareness of being the last link to a knowledge that no one else wanted or could carry. He looked at his family down below. Shem, strong and serious, was helping unload logs with a practical focus that seemed almost cold. Ham, the most turbulent and curious, was trying to tame one of the new calves with a carefree joy that seemed blasphemous to Noah. Japheth, the youngest and most dreamy, was sitting further away, drawing shapes in the dirt, oblivious to everything. They were new people, born again, but he felt they were just the thin surface of a scar, while he was the purulent pus festering underneath it. He sat under the oak's shadow, and the drink began to cause a feeling of vertigo. The world spun gently, and he felt like a tiny point of wounded consciousness in the vastness of a newly washed and indifferent creation. The isolation was absolute. He was the only one to carry the fingerprint of God in that act of genocide, and the oppressive silence of the new earth was, for him, the eternal echo of the final sentence. His soul was emblazoned with a reverent dread and mortal weariness. Noah's drunkenness was not the euphoria that makes one laugh. It was a gradual deterioration of his sense of reality, and along with the vertigo came a strange physical sensation, which he only felt when he was completely disarmed by the drink. He began to feel that his feet were not truly touching the ground. It was as if there was a very thin layer of air, an almost imperceptible bubble between the soles of his leather shoes and the new earth. This feeling of slight flotation was deeply disorienting, giving him the bizarre impression that he was physically disconnected from the rest of creation, as if the earth had gently rejected him for having been an eyewitness to its violent reset. He tried to dig his heels into the mud, but the feeling persisted, an ethereal reminder that he no longer belonged anywhere. The old earth drowned, and the new one treated him as a foreign, unassimilable material. This void beneath his feet was the tactile manifestation of his spiritual isolation, a silent warning that he was the sole survivor of a nightmare and therefore the permanent stranger in a rebuilt paradise. He found himself nervously rubbing his hands, trying to anchor himself to anything palpable. But the alcoholic fog only transformed reality into something fluid and treacherous. In this state of self-imposed flotation and anguish, Noah raised his eyes and through the mist of wine met the gaze of his wife, Noah. The sacred text calls her that, but to him she was simply the companion of centuries. She was a little further down, near the small fire they kept for cooking, and she was not smiling. Her face marked, not by ordinary wrinkles, but by deep lines that looked like carvings of ancient pain, carried an austere beauty and a silent wisdom. Her gaze, for an instant that seemed to stretch and freeze in time, was not one of judgment for the alcohol, but rather of painful and infinite understanding. Noah was the only other person who had lived the world before, who had smelled the rain that wouldn't stop and the oppressive darkness of the months in the ark. And perhaps she too was a guardian of ghosts, though hers were better hidden. In her eyes, which were a deep brown and seemed to carry the weight of the sea, Noah saw a reflection of himself, tired, isolated, and deeply aware of what lay beneath the grass. It was an instant and painful recognition of two spiritual castaways who survived to carry the memory of a genocide. And he felt a fleeting impulse to go down and confess all his horror. But the weight of being the leader and the patriarch held him back, and he merely looked away, leaving Noah with her oppressive silence and her sovereign sadness. The mist of alcohol, which was meant to be a protective veil, began to dissolve into quick, fragmented visions. As he watched the horizon, the undulations in the earth, which he knew were the graves of the masses, seemed to change shape, gaining an even more artificial smoothness, as if something was slowly pulsating beneath the mud. And the subtle crying he had heard before returned, but this time it was not just a lament. It was a symphony of silenced voices, an ethereal choir composed of thousands of muffled whispers, all calling names Noah had forgotten, but which now seemed familiar echoes of a distant past. It was the memory of humanity refusing to die in silence, and it had chosen the last living man to be its forced recipient. That sound did not come from outside, but from inside his skull, resonating in his bones with a low, frightening frequency, like the last murmur of a giant bell submerged in sludge. Noah's terror was that he was, in fact, going mad, or worse, that he was being forced into a telepathic contact with the residual energy field of a mass genocide. He squeezed his temples, feeling his head throb with the force of those voices imploring for oblivion and forgiveness, neither of which he could give them. The climax of this unique and terrifying experience came when he looked up at the sky, seeking the neutrality of blue. However, what he saw was not the serene blue he expected. At the edge of his field of vision, hovering over the horizon of hills that looked like giants' dormitories, was a cloud that did not behave like any other he had seen since leaving the Ark. It was neither a white cumulus nor a grey rain stratus. It was an elongated formation of a faded sepia tone, which seemed to be made of old fire smoke or very fine dust suspended in the air. What was truly extraordinary and unusual was that this cloud had an edge of a vibrant pink, an almost radioactive glow that pulsed slowly, as if the sunlight were being filtered through a dirty crystal prism. And as he watched, the cloud did not move with the wind. It seemed to hover fixedly over a single point, which for Noah, already disoriented and drunk, was the epicenter of the massacre. It was a spectral stain on the clean sky, the cosmic fingerprint of the event he was trying to erase. He felt a shiver of reverence and fear, a bizarre certainty that this was an atmospheric scar, the memory of God hovering over creation, and that only he, the stained patriarch, was being forced to see it in all its silent desolation. The sepia cloud with pink edges, that atmospheric spectre, began to exert a morbid fascination over Noah, sucking all his attention away from the illusory comfort of alcohol. He tried to close his eyes, but the image persisted on his retina, a vibrant after-image that pulsed in the accelerated rhythm of his terrified heart. What made the vision authentically unique and strange was the absolute silence that the cloud seemed to emit. While the rest of the valley murmured with the distant sounds of animals and the work of his children, the area under that anomalous atmospheric mass seemed to be a sonic vacuum. It was as if the sound itself were afraid to approach that stain in the sky, and Noah felt a dry, penetrating cold that was not from the ambient temperature but came from within him, from the feeling of reverence before something he could not rationalize. It was the materialization of pain, the standard of death hovering over the new beginning, and he felt compelled to bow in adoration and, at the same time, flee in panic before that phenomenon that only he could witness. He was the forced observer of the open wound in the new creation, and the sickly pink glow of the cloud's edge seemed like a divine sign screaming, "I have not forgotten." Averting his gaze from that celestial testimony of his trauma, Noah tried to occupy his hands, seeking the anchor in the practical that the drink had stolen. He felt the pocket of his worn linen tunic and felt the touch of the wooden stake he had carried since leaving the ark. It was a simple, blunt-tipped stake that he used to mark the planting rows. However, this stake was not common. It was made of a fragment of the ark itself, a piece of the gopher wood that he had hewn before touching the ground, a trophy of survival and a constant burden. At that moment, with his mind clouded, Noah began to notice that the wood, which should have been dry and inert, was strangely damp on one of its sides, and the smell. It was not the smell of freshly cut wood, but a subtle and complex odor that he could only identify with his memory as a forced sailor. It was the ferrous smell of rust in salt water mixed with the sweet and sickly aroma of decaying water lily. It was the flood water impregnated in that splinter of wood, and he had the bizarre and paranoid conviction that the fragment of the ark was crying, sweating the salty tears of the waters that swallowed the world. He felt contaminated, as if the wood itself were liquefying in his hands, and this intimate and terrifying detail only served to prove his condition as a stained instrument and the bearer of a living memory that not even inanimate objects could bear. The sensation of having the memory of the flood crying in his hands with that damp stake made Noah feel a physical revulsion towards himself. He was a dirty man, not with mud, but with cursed knowledge. He looked down and saw Noah, his wife, who was now turning her back to tend the fire. They were the wisest backs he knew, and for an instant he had the paranoiac conviction that she had not turned away by chance. Her movement was not casual work, but rather a subtle yet profound rejection of the contamination he carried. He saw her rub her own arm with a nervous quickness after touching one of his clothes left beside the fire, and he interpreted that instantly. She was trying to get rid of the dust of the old world that only he exhaled. His terror was realizing that she knew that even though they never spoke about the horror, the invisible weight of guilt and trauma manifested in the physical space between them, creating an insurmountable barrier. Noah was the last companion of his pain, but now even she seemed to be subtly isolating herself, leaving him completely alone to fight the ghosts that haunted him. That fleeting gesture of revulsion hurt more than any words, carving into his chest the certainty that he was the bearer of a curse that threatened to contaminate the very beginning of humanity. This feeling of incurable impurity led him to a desperate and totally irrational act. With a savage impulse, he threw the wooden stake away. It fell with a dull, heavy thud onto the soft earth, and then he knelt down and began to rub his own hands vigorously in the mud. He was not washing his hands. He was trying to perform a desperate ablution with the very soil of the new earth, seeking an earthly redemption that the God of his faith did not seem to grant him. Noah plunged his hands into the mud, rubbing the sludge between his fingers, feeling the cold, granular texture against his skin, hoping that the virgin earth could absorb the smell of rot and death he felt in himself. But instead of feeling clean, he felt something strange and unprecedented. The mud covering his hands began to get warm, with a temperature subtly above normal, almost as if it were chemically reacting to contact with his skin, and the warmth was accompanied by an odor even stronger and sweeter than the water lily, a smell he immediately associated with the stagnant, effervescent water he had seen in the corners of the ark, the smell of life draining away. It was as if the mud, instead of cleansing him, were rejecting him and exhaling the trauma back, reminding him that the global cemetery was alive in his memory and everywhere. Noah's irrational act of rubbing himself with the warm mud did not go unnoticed. Shem, his firstborn, the most serious and observant of them all, saw the scene from afar. Shem, with his deep eyes and a furrowed brow that seemed to carry the weight of an unknown future, approached his father with a mixture of filial respect and bitter resignation. He did not utter words of judgment for the alcohol. The patriarch's drunkenness was the family's open secret, a silent disease they all pretended not to see, but which shaped everyone's life. However, Shem's gaze was a cold dagger to Noah, because it was not the reproach of a son, but the disappointment of a successor who saw his leader collapsing under the burden. What hurt Noah the most was that Shem did not understand the root of the despair. For Shem, the water was a great and frightening event, but for Noah, it was the end of a universe. Shem couldn't know what it was like to be a stained instrument, and his son's practical youth made him feel obsolete and contaminated. In that moment, Shem's silence was the loudest and most accusing sound Noah could hear, an implicit condemnation that only intensified the unbearable guilt of being the only one to carry the complete memory of that genocide. To escape Shem's oppressive gaze, Noah stood up, staggering, and began to walk towards a small grey rock that stood out on the plain. The intention was to find a blind spot, a place where he could drown himself in drink unseen, but the universe had other plans for his visual torture. Upon reaching the rock, he noticed a geological anomaly that made him stop mid-step, despite the alcoholic vertigo. At the top of the stone, there was a perfectly round hole, a span in diameter, but it was not a natural cavity carved by the wind or water. The inside of the hole was a vibrant rust red, and even more bizarre, was lined with something that looked like scales, with a rough, mineralized texture. Noah extended his trembling hand and touched the lining. It was cold and hard, but its shape was clearly organic. In that instant, his reality shattered. He had the instant certainty that he was not looking at a rock, but at the mineralized fossil of the shell of a giant eye, the petrified remnant of some cyclopean, monstrous creature that inhabited the world of yore, and which the water had left there as a warning that the horror was much greater than he could conceive. It was the materialization of dread, a bizarre reminiscence of a unique life form that only he had seen before the purge, and the rusty gleam of the petrified pupil seemed to look back at him with the oppressive silence of someone who knew too much. The sight of that petrified giant eye, which seemed to peer at him from the mud, was the final nail in Noah's little sanity. The horror was not just the size or the bizarre shape. It was the direct implication that the world he knew and that God had destroyed was much stranger and darker than the simplistic narratives he told his children. That fossil was proof of a cosmic terror that he was the only one to witness, and the only living witness that the punishment had been against much more than human wickedness. A reverent dread struck him, a mixture of fascination and nausea, and he felt that he was violating a primordial secret just by being there, observing. He turned his back to the rock with a staggering speed, the alcohol mixed with the shock creating a wave of vertigo. That eye, he was sure, was a silent sentinel, a bizarre memorial left by creation itself to remind him that his survival was not an honor, but a burden. He moved away from the spot with a desperate urgency to find the contaminated wooden stake he had thrown away again. The object, made from the Ark prison, was now the only artifact that seemed to share his pain and his stained consciousness, the trauma sibling he desperately needed to keep close. He returned to the vineyard spot, his eyes bloodshot and his breathing heavy, and found the gopher stake tossed near the fence. As he picked it up, the damp wood and the smell of rotting water lily flooded his senses again, but this time fear gave way to a sick obsession. He began to rub the stake with the hem of his tunic, with the silent fury of someone trying to clean a bloodstain that would never come out. And as he did this, the wood reacted in a way that defied any law of nature he knew. Noah felt the texture change beneath his fingers, and he realized that the smell intensified to such an extent that he had to cough. The bizarre detail came when he looked closely. The gopher wood, in the part he was rubbing, was oozing a thick, pale yellow viscous resin, which glowed faintly under the afternoon sun, like fossilized honey. And on the surface of this resin, he saw tiny bubbles rising and bursting, releasing the smell of rust and salt water. It was as if the trauma of the flood had solidified in that stake and was now being purged in the form of that luminous resin. He held the living artifact of his horror, an organic logbook that only his troubled mind could activate, proving to him that the past was not dead. It was only crystallized and waiting for the touch of the last man to manifest. While Noah was absorbed in that frantic and useless cleaning of the resin-weeping stake, he was interrupted by Ham, who approached with the bold curiosity that always characterized him. Ham, with the look of someone about to play a trick, saw his father kneeling in the mud, sweating, and the yellowish resin running down the wood, and did not feel the reverence that Shem showed. What Ham saw was his father's weakness, the humiliation of a leader dissolving into alcoholic desperation and superstition. Noah perceived Ham's muffled laugh, the juvenile disdain that was the purest form of isolation for the patriarch. Ham did not understand the weight of memory. To him, Noah was just a strange, drunk old man clinging to legends of a past he couldn't even imagine. Noah's terror in that moment was realizing that his pain was invisible and that to the new generation, he was just the stain to be ignored. Ham walked away, shaking his head in amused disapproval, and Noah felt the last thread of dignity break. The inability to share the unspeakable horror was what was destroying him, and Ham's casual contempt was the final proof that he was condemned to carry the burden alone, the last ghost in a land of the living who did not recognize him. The solitude was a scream, in the silence that only he could hear, and his son's indifferent reaction was the echo of that void. The pain of Ham's contempt propelled him to stand up and walk away, but as he took the first step, the bizarre manifestation of the trauma reached its climax. The ethereal fog and mental fatigue gave way to a terrible clarity. The sepia cloud hovering over the horizon, that atmospheric scar with the pink edge, began to flash slowly. It was not lightning, it was an internal light emission, a soft, intermittent pulse that illuminated the edge with a sickly phosphorescent glow. And along with the flashing, the subtle crying he had heard before became closer and denser. It was no longer a choir of whispers, but the deep, grave sound of something that resembled the crushing of dry bones under unbearable pressure. Noah felt the earth tremble slightly beneath his feet, a low-frequency vibration that reverberated in his chest, and he had the absolute conviction that nature was remembering. That light and sound phenomenon was not meant to frighten him. It was a bizarre communication from creation itself telling him, "You are not crazy, you are right." The horror happened. He fell to his knees again, no longer from the drink, but from reverent dread and the absolute sense of wonder before the manifestation of a pain that was his and the world's, the last ritual of a god he could no longer understand. As the earth trembled with the low-frequency vibration and the spectral cloud flashed in the sky, Noah, amidst his reverent panic, turned his eyes to the gopher stake he was still holding. The yellowish, viscous resin oozing from the wood now shone with incredible intensity. But what was truly unprecedented and bizarre was the color of the light it emitted. It was not a white glow, nor the pale yellow of the resin, but a deep, profoundly cold, cobalt-blue tone, which seemed to absorb the heat from everything around it. The blue light did not illuminate the area, but created even darker shadows in the recesses of the wood, giving it the appearance of a submerged object, as if the fragment were returning to its original state underwater. He felt the biting cold emanating from that blue glow, and had the terrifying certainty that he was holding a piece of the primordial ocean, a capsule of the flood activated by his own anguish. It was the liquid memory of the ancient world, manifesting in a unique light phenomenon, an individual experience he could never describe to his children, and which caused him a feeling of wonder mixed with the dread of losing control over his own reality. That blue was the final seal that he was the sole guardian of the horror. Dominated by the urgency to get rid of that living, weeping artifact of his guilt, Noah, in a gesture of pure practical despair, decided that throwing it away was not enough. The stake was the conduit between his trauma and the bizarre manifestations of the world. He needed to destroy the object to break the connection with the past. Staggering, he ran to the fire, the very one where Noah had been before, and which still burned with an honest red flame. The attempt to drown the memory in alcohol had failed, and the only solution left to the demoralized leader was an act of purification through matter. With a silent cry that got stuck in his throat, he hurled the gopher stake, which was still pulsing with the cobalt-blue glow, directly into the red flames. The collision of the contaminated wood and the purifying fire created an immediate and strange reaction, something that generated a desperate hope in his heart that the nightmare would end, and that he could finally connect with the new earth, ceasing to be the cold mud that covered the dead, and becoming the seed of the new beginning. The moment the gopher stake hit the fire, the reaction was immediately spectacular and bizarre, something that only that person, at that exact moment, could have witnessed. The fragment of the ark, still pulsing with the cobalt-blue light, did not catch fire the way common wood would. Instead of burning, it began to sizzle and hiss, and a dense smoke of an unusual color rose from the fire. The smoke was neither white nor gray, but a vibrant emerald green tone, which spiraled and spun rapidly, rising in a perfectly vertical column that seemed to defy the wind. And the smell emanating from that emerald vortex was the synthesis of all his nightmare: the salt water, the sweet rot of the water lily, and now an intense ozone odor like the air before an electrical storm. Noah, paralyzed in alcoholic and stunned panic, watched that column of green smoke, convinced that he was witnessing the violent purification of the flood's memory, which was being forced to vaporize before him. It was a moment of pure terror and wonder, the unique and indescribable experience of seeing the toxic past turn into colored mist, and he felt for an instant less heavy, as if the earth and fire were performing an exorcism that his faith could not complete. The climax of the event came when the column of emerald smoke rose high enough to meet the sepia cloud hovering over the horizon, that atmospheric scar that pulsed with the pink glow. When the green smoke touched the lower limit of the cloud, a secondary and even more spectacular light phenomenon occurred. The phosphorescent pink edge of the cloud intensified dramatically, transforming into an inverted rainbow of dark and unusual colors, shades of deep purple, rusty orange, and an electric blue that was almost black. And the sound of crushing bones he had heard before abruptly ceased, replaced by an oppressive and absolute silence, a vacuum where sound should be. In that moment of reverent silence, Noah had the clear and sober vision that creation was communicating its pain through those unique visual phenomena, and that his desperate attempt to destroy the artifact had been answered by the cosmos itself. He was the convergence point between human guilt and divine memory, the sole spectator of the last breath of a world. He fell seated, his hands in the warm mud, completely exhausted, but with the terrifying certainty that, bizarre as it was, it had happened, and he was the living testimony of a force that surpassed his understanding and his pain. As suddenly as it began, the spectacle stopped. The column of emerald green smoke dissipated into the air as if it had never existed. The sepia cloud returned to its static, pulsating form, and the silence fell upon the valley with the weight of a stone slab. Noah, sitting there, felt the smell of ozone and sweet rot slowly fading away, leaving behind only the fresh, clean air of the new earth. The silence was now real, and not the oppressive silence of memory. He looked at the fire, and the gopher stake had completely disappeared, vaporized. There were no black ashes, no embers, just the honest red fire burning ordinary firewood, as if nothing had happened. This total and clean disappearance of the artifact hit him with a wave of relief, but also with a cold, rational terror. The burden of survival had manifested, been exorcised by fire, and he was the only one to carry the proof that the trauma was tangible. He felt empty and completely alone, like a vessel that had just been drained, and the sobriety, which had arrived with the shock, was now a silent desert where he was the only traveler. The world had normalized, but he was irreversibly altered. The next scene, however, carved Noah's isolation into his heart in a way more painful than any hallucination. Shem and Ham, alerted by the intense smell of ozone, which was strong enough to reach everyone, but not the colors and sound of the event, ran to the fire. Noah observed their reaction, and that was the final confirmation of his solitude. They looked at the fire, then at their staggering, mud-covered father, and the only thing they questioned was the strange-smelling smoke. Ham, with his air of juvenile sarcasm, asked if he had burned a dead animal on purpose, and Shem merely observed the sepia cloud on the horizon, now motionless, with a furrow of practical concern about the weather, and not reverence. They did not see the cobalt-blue, did not hear the crushing, did not notice the inverted rainbow. The cosmic manifestation of his trauma had been exclusively for him, the last patriarch, who could not share the pain. In that instant, Noah knew that he was the only one carrying the vivid memory, and that to the rest of his family, he would forever be the demoralized leader who drank to forget and did strange things in the mud. He felt a renewed guilt, but this time, not for surviving, but for his inability to connect with his own children. That night, Noah did not drink. The forced sobriety from the shock was a cold blade in his mind. He watched the fire slowly die out, and the feeling of flotation, that invisible air bubble beneath. His feet that disconnected him from the earth had disappeared. The cold mud beneath him felt real and solid for the first time in a long time. The exorcism of the stake had had an immediate physical effect. The bizarre manifestation of the trauma had been interrupted. However, what remained was not peace, but an even deeper void. The vivid, detailed memory of the genocide had not disappeared. It was now anchored solely within him, without the stake as a conduit or the atmospheric manifestations. The guilt was alone, crystallized in his chest, and he felt like a deep, silent well that held the dead water of the whole world. He was the last guardian of a secret that eternally isolated him from his own family. The terror was that he had stopped fighting. The practical solution he took, the burning of the artifact, had only left him alone with the monster in his mind. The sun rose the next day, golden and indifferent, over the new earth. Noah got up, tired, but without the vertigo of the drink. He was the patriarch, the last man to carry the memory of the world of yore, and he wore his invisible burden like a new tunic. He returned to work, planting the vineyards, the eternal task of one who starts anew in a global cemetery. He continued to be the demoralized leader, the man of oppressive silence, and he would continue to seek oblivion in wine, which would be his documented credible error, the human attempt to drown memory. What had happened that day? The cloud, the crying, the blue stake. He never told anyone. The experience remained with him, unique and indescribable, the personal secret of the man who survived to be the contaminated beginning of all future humanity. He never saw the emerald smoke again, nor the cobalt-blue glow, but the feeling of reverence and the mute terror of that day remained, anchored in his soul, proving to him that the horror had been real and that he, Noah, was the only one to remember the silence of guilt that lay beneath every grain of earth.